The leaders of Germany's Conservatives and the centre-left Social Democrats have announced
66% are in favour of more defence spending, according to a survey by Infotest DMAP.
Germany no longer seems to care about debt. Welcome to this new reality.
You won't believe what Germany just announced. This news is a game changer that has left Europe and even the world stunned. A decision so massive that even the EU is scrambling to figure out what it means and what comes next. With the new government coming together and a most expected back and forth negotiations, Germany has dropped a plan so ambitious, so unexpected, that it could completely reshape not just its own future, but the entire balance of power in Europe. Some are calling it a bold leap forward, while others are already sounding the alarm. So, what exactly is happening, and why is this move sending ripple effects across the globe? Let's break it down. Germany's latest election, held on February 23rd, 2025, didn't just shake up the political scene, it completely rewrote the script. The CDU-CSU alliance, led by Friedrich Merz, won the most votes, securing 28.5% and 208 seats in the Bundestag. But with no majority, Merz now faces the tough job of forming a coalition. Meanwhile, the far-right AfD surged to 20.8%, its strongest result ever, dominating eastern Germany with 152 seats. The biggest shock was that the SPD, once Germany's political powerhouse, collapsed to just 16.4% and 120 seats, marking its worst performance since 1887. As coalition talks kicked off, many expected the usual political bargaining, quiet negotiations, minor compromises, and business as usual. Instead, Germany threw everyone a curveball. In a surprising turn, the CDU, CSU, and SPD outlined a preliminary deal that includes a massive, no-limits defense budget, a €500 billion push to overhaul infrastructure, and sweeping changes to immigration and economic policy. If that sounds like a lot, that's because it is. Here's how they plan to pull it off. Germany's infamous debt brake usually limits government borrowing to 0.35% of GDP. But under this new deal, anything spent on defense beyond 1% of GDP won't count toward that cap. Translation? The military budget just got a massive loophole. With Germany's GDP sitting at around 4.3 trillion euros in 2024, 1% of that is roughly 43 billion euros, and any defense spending beyond that will be exempt from borrowing limits. This is a game changer. It means Germany can expand its military budget far beyond the current 52 billion euros, finally hitting NATO's target of 2% of GDP for defense. In 2024, Germany technically met that goal, but only because of a special fund created after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That fund is running dry, and with uncertainty around US support in the future, Germany might have to ramp up military spending even more, possibly reaching 140 billion euros, or a whopping 3.5% of GDP, according to recent research. But it's not just about the money. The new government also plans to speed up military procurement. Within 6 months of taking office, they'll roll out an emergency plan to fast-track equipment, armaments, and anything else the Bundeswehr needs. Because, as Germany has learned, military upgrades shouldn't take longer than the wars they were meant to prepare for. As if the defense spending shakeup wasn't enough, the €500 billion plan is actually for Germany's infrastructure over the next 10 years, and it won't be tied to the usual budget limits. This money will go toward roads, railways, digital infrastructure, energy projects, hospitals, education, and scientific research. Basically, everything that keeps a country running. On top of that, a chunk of it will be used for civil defense and disaster preparedness, a clear sign that Germany isn't taking any chances in an increasingly unpredictable world. With a budget like this, Germany isn't just trying to patch up roads, it's making sure the entire system, from transport to technology, is future-proof. And considering how long German bureaucracy usually takes to approve big projects, this off-budget fund is meant to cut through the red tape and get things moving. Out of the massive €500 billion infrastructure fund, a solid €100 billion is being set aside for Germany's states and municipalities. Why? because many of them are drowning in financial deficits, and without extra funding, even the best laid plans would stall before they even begin. This money is meant to keep local projects moving, whether it's fixing aging roads, upgrading public transport, or making sure schools don't feel like they belong in the 1980s. But it's not just about handouts. Under this deal, states will also be allowed to borrow more, up to 0.35% of GDP per year, following the same fiscal rule the federal government operates under. It's a calculated move, giving states more financial flexibility without completely throwing the debt brake out the window. Speaking of the debt brake, Germany has been wrestling with this rule for years. While it was designed to prevent reckless spending, critics argue that it has strangled investment in crucial areas like infrastructure, technology, and defense. Now, the government is finally admitting that the system needs an update. To figure out how to fix it, a commission of experts will be tasked with coming up with a modernized version, one that allows for necessary investments without completely opening the floodgates on borrowing. Their recommendations will lay the groundwork for a debt brake reform bill, which the government aims to finalize by the end of 2025. In short, Germany is trying to balance fiscal responsibility with much-needed modernization. It's a tricky act, but one thing's clear. The old way of doing things just isn't cutting it anymore. Not everyone is cheering for Germany's ambitious spending plans. In fact, Germany's Greens are gearing up for a fight. If you're not familiar, Germany's Greens are a political party that champions climate action, social justice, and fiscal responsibility, which, in this case, means they're not thrilled about Friedrich Merz's plans to go on a massive borrowing spree. Their biggest concern is the €500 billion infrastructure fund and sweeping debt rule reforms. They believe reckless borrowing could spiral out of control and put Germany's long-term financial health at risk. While markets and investors were celebrating the spending boom, the Greens were slamming the brakes, vowing to block any move that weakens Germany's debt rules. But here's where things get interesting. They're not completely shutting the door on negotiations. The party is willing to discuss military upgrades and economic growth measures, as long as they align with their principles. Instead of just saying no to everything, they plan to introduce their own proposals and negotiate with Merz's CDU-CSU alliance and the SPD to find a middle ground on March 10th. Friedrich Merz isn't wasting any time. Fresh off his election victory, he's sounding the alarm on Europe's security, saying it's 5 minutes to midnight, meaning if Germany doesn't increase defense spending now, it might be too late. With Russia growing more aggressive and the US becoming less reliable, Merz believes Europe needs to step up and take charge of its own protection. But there's a problem. Merz and SPD leader Lars Klingbeil need the Greens on board to get these plans through Parliament. Greens co-leader Franziska Brandner made it crystal clear. Her party wouldn't be blackmailed into supporting Merz's agenda just because Europe is in a tough spot. She argued that rushing these measures through without proper negotiations wasn't good for Germany or Europe. Katharina Droga, another top Green leader, took it a step further, saying her party wouldn't vote for Merz's proposals unless they included serious commitments to climate action and economic reforms. Basically, they're telling Merz, "You want our support? Then meet us halfway." Some in Merz's camp think the Greens are just playing hardball to secure more concessions. And they might not be wrong, but SPD leader Klingbeil insists their concerns are being taken seriously and are part of the ongoing negotiations. While Merz and the Greens go back and forth, the far-right Alternative for Germany, AfD, isn't waiting around. Just recently, they took things to court, filing a legal challenge to block Merz's proposals from even being debated in Parliament. The party, which has been vehemently against the spending plans, called them a flood of debt and argued they would wreck Germany's financial stability. A court spokesperson confirmed that the challenges were being processed, but there was no word yet on when a ruling would come. In the meantime, the political showdown over Germany's future continues. The Greens aren't just saying no for the sake of it. They have a clear list of demands, and they're pushing hard for them. Number one on their list is debt brake reform. The Greens want to overhaul Germany's strict borrowing limits immediately, not sometime in the future. Number two is more climate spending. They're insisting that €200 billion of the €500 billion infrastructure fund be allocated to state-level projects, double the current plan. Number three is tackling inequality. Instead of pushing for income and corporate tax reforms, which Merz and the SPD have already agreed on, Green spokesperson Katharina Beck suggested introducing a wealth tax instead. Number 4 is focus on social issues. They argue that Merz's plan doesn't do enough to address affordable housing or wealth creation for lower-income Germans. Beck summed up their stance by saying that massive investment in infrastructure is absolutely necessary, something the Greens have been pushing for years, but they won't support a plan that hands out tax breaks to the wealthy while ignoring the country's deeper social problems. With both sides standing firm, it's clear that Germany's new government won't come together without a serious fight. And with the AfD trying to shut things down in court, this political standoff is far from over. Germany's bold economic overhaul is already making waves in global markets, especially in its own backyard. After incoming Chancellor Friedrich Merz unveiled his ambitious €500 billion investment plan, investors wasted no time reacting. The result was a financial roller coaster. Germany's bond market saw its sharpest weekly sell-off since the 1990s, with 10-year bond yields shooting up by more than 40 basis points to nearly 2.9%. And that was just the beginning. The yield on Germany's 30-year bonds also saw its biggest one-day spike in decades, leaving analysts scrambling to reassess their outlook on Europe's economic future. For years, German government bonds, also known as Bunds, were the gold standard of stability in European debt markets. Investors treated them like a safe haven, with their yields influencing borrowing costs across the continent. But now, thanks to Germany's spending spree, the market is bracing for a flood of new bonds, and yields are climbing fast. Some analysts predict that the 10-year Bund yield could crack 3%, a level it hasn't held since the global financial crisis. And if German bonds are offering higher returns, that means investors will start demanding higher yields elsewhere too. Borrowing costs in France and Italy have already surged by around 40 basis points, adding pressure to governments with far more fragile economies than Germany. Even the US and Japan aren't immune. British gilt yields have jumped, and Japanese 10-year bonds hit a 16-year high as investors adjust to this new reality. The shift is causing a major rethink in global finance. Cal El-Wahab, a top trader at Bank of America, admitted that Germany's economic transformation was changing the way clients view Europe completely. For years, investors assumed Europe would be stuck in sluggish economic growth, but now, with Germany leading the charge, they are reconsidering. This fiscal shakeup could add as much as 1.5% to Germany's GDP growth by 2030 and boost the Eurozone economy by 0.8%, according to BNP Paribas. Meanwhile, Commerzbank predicts that over the next decade, Germany's new policies could rack up more than €1 trillion in additional debt, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. But it's not just Europe that's feeling the impact. Goldman Sachs now sees German yields rising even further, estimating they could land somewhere between 3.0% and 3.75%. That has major implications for global capital flows. If bonds start offering returns comparable to US Treasuries, some investors might move their money out of American markets and into Germany's. Amundi's Monica Defend warns that this could trigger capital outflows from the US as higher-yielding bonds become direct competitors to treasuries. Japan is also watching closely. Traditionally, Japanese institutional investors, especially life insurers, have parked billions of dollars in foreign bonds, carefully balancing risks and returns. But now, with bonds yielding close to 3%, some analysts believe Japan's government bonds, JGBs, will need to offer even higher yields to stay competitive. Vanguard's Ailes Coutney suggests that a 2% yield on Japanese 10-year bonds is now a realistic target as German policy shifts shake up global investment flows. Of course, not everyone is convinced this surge will last. Nuveen strategist Laura Cooper pointed out that uncertainty around US tariffs could slow down the rise in German yields. Meanwhile, Aviva investors Vasileios Gikionakis argued that Bund yields could overshoot their fair value of 3.1 to 3.2%, noting that market shifts like these rarely stop at equilibrium. So, what happens next? For decades, Germany's strict debt rules kept its borrowing in check and made Bunds some of the most stable assets in the world. Now, the country is stepping into unfamiliar territory, rewriting economic rules that once seemed set in stone. Investors, economists, and policymakers everywhere are watching closely. Because if Germany is breaking free from its old financial playbook, the rest of the world may have to adjust too.